Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 3 in our deep dive on Sean Diddy Combs. Let's continue with the chronology. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist, a professor, and a YouTuber and podcaster.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I dig in snow to try to find some cool ice cubes.
We left off in 1995, and I wanted to get into the East Coast, West Coast feud because it pertains to things that are relevant to Sean Combs and what might be his behavior, which might be an indication of his psychology. So what do you know about the East Coast, West Coast feud?
Well, what I know is that it started off with some, feelings of like, no, the true hip hop is this. No, the true hip hop is this. But then it started escalating into insults. And then the most prominent figures I know, of course, were Biggie and Tupac. And they started insulting each other in each other's videos. And then it escalated. I also know that at some point, Tupac was shot. That wasn't alleged. He was shot, nearly killed. And in the recording studio, and I think in New York, right? And it seems like many people thought that was arranged by Sean Combs.
Right.
But and then of course, when he was finally killed, that many people think that Sean Combs ordered it as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get into some of the specifics. So the East Coast, you had Biggie and Nas and Jay-Z and Sean Combs on one side, and on the West Coast, you had Tupac, Dr. Dre, and Snoop, and Suge Knight. So I wanted to talk about Suge Knight a little bit, even though it's not directly related to Sean Combs, as a way of illuminating hip-hop culture in the 90s. Because one of the questions that we have is, how did Sean Combs get away with what he was doing? But Sean Combs isn't the only individual that was getting away with horrific things and still being rewarded for and maybe even legitimized by their criminal activity. So Suge Knight, the co-founder of Death Row Records, and one way of thinking about this is that you have this beef between East Coast, West Coast, both headed by complete psychopathic individuals. And I don't say that lightly.
Right.
Suge Knight is a different kind of psychopath, seemingly. But as we've been talking about with Sean Combs, if the allegations are even close to the mark, and we could imagine there being thousands of victims potentially, we're talking about significant psychopathy that is really rare.
Yeah.
And it points to a possibility that in order to actually succeed as a leader in this industry at the time, you needed to be a psychopath. You needed to lack empathy. You needed to be callous. You needed to be seen as a dangerous, violent, criminal individual or something. I don't know, because you have if you had just one, that'd be one thing. But
these two most prominent.
These were the most prominent labels by far, and both have leaders that are horrific individual. In any other world, they would just be considered another Ted Bundy or something. You know what I mean?
Well, it's funny because I, obviously not knowing anything, up until the last couple of years, or no, maybe up until the news really started breaking, I always imagined that Sean Combs was a more standard business person, kind of staying out of the fray.
Right.
And then that it was only Suge Knight that was like really crazy and atrocious. Come to find out that potentially that's
Sean Combs could be, in some metrics,
worse.
1,000 times worse. So with Suge Knight, do you know what he's done criminally over the years?
Well, I remember for one thing, there was that video where he traps someone's arm in the truck and he drives and I don't know if the guy died or not. I also know he's attached to murderers for sure.
Yeah.
And I know that he strong-armed multiple artists and things like that, but I don't know exactly.
Yeah. So that's the gist of it. But to be specific about the video, the security footage of him running, or you were saying he was grabbing.
I don't remember the detail. I remember seeing the video. I know there was a truck, a Suge Knight, and another dude involved.
Yeah. So Suge Knight is in a pretty big truck, a pretty beefy truck, and he brutally runs over,
he runs them over,
2 or 3 men that he knew.
Yeah.
They were involved in the movie Straight Outta Compton, because I think he might have been there just as moral support or even as a source of information for how to tell the story, And he was with one of the filmmakers or something, but
oh wow,
or one of the people involved in, these weren't just like, I don't know,
randos.
Yeah. And he killed one and seriously injured another person. And
wait, these were actors or these were people involved behind the scenes kind of advising?
One person behind the scene, and also another person that he ran over was his friend.
Oh my gosh.
So he claimed in court that it was self-defense, that they lured him there to kill him. And I don't know all the details, but the jury did not believe that defense, and he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison, and he's currently in prison right now. This video I've seen a number of times. I remember seeing it back in the day, and I rewatched it for this deep dive. It is brutal what he does, and it does not look like self-defense in the least. It looks like a guy who is intending on killing people with his giant truck and just brutally runs people over. It's really, really disturbing. And this is just one of the crimes that he has been convicted of that we have video evidence of. I mean, God knows what he's done. So yeah, he's been alleged and convicted and corroborated on a number of crimes: beating people, assaulting women, money fraud, drug possession, gun possession, robbery, probation violations. He went to prison from 97 to 2001, and then again from 2003 to 2004, and then he also went to prison again in 2008, and then he went to prison again in 2015.
Jeez,
and this one likely will stick for a lot longer. So 4 bouts of prison, and yet throughout a lot of this time, he was still a respected executive in the hip hop industry.
Also, you would think that, okay, you go to the prison the first time, but you've got all this money and success. Maybe you back off and nope.
Right. That's why it looks like there's something wrong with him, right?
That you just can't stop himself.
Yeah. Running those guys over in 2015 for no reason.
Broad daylight.
It was, being filmed. I think he was just mad at the guys.
Yeah.
I think he was just ranting and raving and upset about something about the movie or something. Anyway.
Did you ever have this feeling? When I was a kid, I remember just the distinction in Colombia. I would notice some people didn't seem to care about physical consequences. And I was always concerned about those people, right? Because what I mean is, like, you could imagine getting in an altercation with someone, but they knew that at some point there has to be a limit. Like, okay, maybe we'll punch each other, but there'll be a limit. But then there were some kids, not many, some kids where I always got the sense, like, I don't know if this kid's got a limit. Like, he might break someone's finger, he might stab someone's eye out, I don't know. And that's that kind of archetype. Like, they don't care. They're just mad. They're going to do whatever. Oh, I ran you over. Oh, did I blow up your head? Sorry. That's what I did.
Right. Yeah. Most people have a limit, right?
Yeah.
They have a lot of checks and balances in their mind that would prevent them, even when it might benefit them to do so. There's actually a lot of literature and research on how soldiers in war, even when the enemy is bearing down on them, they still won't shoot because they don't want to hurt another human being because it's against our nature to do so. Anyway, so many think, as a part of this speculation and the conspiracy, that he orchestrated or knew about the murders of Tupac and Biggie, but there's not a lot of direct evidence of that, but it's possible. So the feud, East Coast, West Coast, as you were saying, there was a lot of talking shit about each other, diss tracks, accusations, this kind of thing. And the fans got involved as well. There were accounts of fans attacking each other and some pretty severe violence. And it got me thinking about other beefs or feuds in the music industry, albeit maybe less violent.
Yeah.
But what other feuds in the music industry can you think of?
Well, I remember some made up ones that I don't think amounted to reality. Like Prince and Michael were supposed to be competing,
Yeah.
The
press and culture loves this.
Yeah.
Like there was some the press were asking, I think Billie Eilish and Chappell Roan, maybe, I can't.
If they were like.
There's a conscious effort by them to say, we're not beefing and stop acting like we are that. I think I have this right. But anyway.
Real beefs between Eazy-E and Ice Cube and the rest, right? Like that was real.
Okay. Yeah. What about other genres?
Okay, let's see. In rock, of course, yeah. So like bands, like Oasis and Blur, you know, they hate each other. And actually, I do believe they really do hate each other.
Yeah.
And
because always the question is, are they just doing it for the press?
I think that one was real. I think the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, there was no real beef, but that was another big one. It's like, ooh, yeah. What else?
But you got Guns N' Roses and Nirvana. They had a real beef. They had a real beef.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think back at that time because in the 80s you had the development of hair rock, right? Vixen and Motley Crue and this kind of thing. And I remember when Guns N' Roses came out, it was very different.
Very different.
It felt way more real and raw
and good, and it was good music, honestly.
Right, a lot better music.
Yeah.
But then when Nirvana came out and other bands, Soundgarden, they were even more raw.
Yeah.
Dude, I think Guns N' Roses resented because there was this real brief window from like 89 to 91 where Guns N' Roses was untouchable.
The kings.
And then immediately they were, because to Nirvana and Soundgarden, and really to me, Guns N' Roses was just a hair away from Motley Crue.
It was the remnants, yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of that category. Similar to another Seattle band, Queensryche. Yeah.
Silent next to you.
Yeah, so Queensryche also was a little bit more alternative, was not as much of a sellout as your Vixens and your Motley Crues.
Did you know that in my first band, I worked with the lawyer who was the lawyer for Queensryche?
Oh, yeah?
Because we were like, we needed a high power. It's so silly. We're a band, so we need a high power attorney, and we just found this guy.
What did you use the attorney for?
To sign like a contract about being in the band. It really like amounted to nothing. It was just...
I will say that's very you,
putting carts ahead of the horses.
Other feuds, Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, Nicki Minaj and Cardi B, Katy Perry and Taylor Swift.
Metallica and Megadeth. Eminem and Machine Gun Kelly.
Exactly. Also Drake and Kendrick.
Oh, that's real. That's ugly and real.
Yeah. East Coast, West Coast, similar in some ways to those beefs, different in that you have potentially murders. At the very least, you had some pretty severe violence that was happening. Imagine fans of Britney and Christina being brutally violent with each other when they run into each other at a 7-Eleven. You just wouldn't imagine that happening, or at least I don't think so. Whereas with the East Coast, West Coast thing, it became a serious thing for some people. For the vast majority of fans and people in public, it was just a way to have pride in your coast and to talk shit about the other coast. That that was all that it was.
But I mean, I do remember because I was pretty sure it was all just for show, and then all of a sudden, like Tupac gets killed. I was like, and I wasn't like, oh my God, Tupac. I didn't have a personal attachment to Tupac, but it was like, oh wait a minute, they're actually at war with each other.
Well. Yeah, that's the way it certainly from the fan perspective, it looked like that. It played into exactly the expectations of what that world is like, But actually, there's been some recent... Well, anyway, let's take a break, and then we'll get into that. What do you say, Bert?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So, speaking of 1996, a year later, Tupac was shot and killed in Vegas. This was the second time he was shot, as you were talking about. The first time he didn't die. But... he dies this time. So do you know any theories, the prevailing theories as to who shot him and why?
Well, there was that guy they charged finally. Anyways, what I've heard in the more recent years is that Sean Combs paid someone to kill him. That's what I've heard.
Yeah. The prevailing theory and also the sort of distant perspective, obvious conclusion is that you had this beef between East and West Coast. You had Sean Combs and Suge Knight at the helm, and there were diss tracks. And, it's one thing when John Lennon writes a song, How Do You Sleep at Night?
Yeah.
And Paul McCartney writes a song about 3 legs.
Yeah.
3-legged dog or something, right? It's another thing, the kind of shit they were saying about each other in these songs.
Yes.
And the kind of things they were doing in the videos. So to the audience, it just seemed like, oh, well, obviously Biggie and Sean Combs had Tupac killed because of the shit that he was saying. He was asking for it, or this is the sort of thing happens on the street every day. Unfortunately, that's true. Have you heard any other theories as to who shot him and why?
I mean, I've certainly heard that he's not dead, but I know I don't remember.
Well, so there's been some recent developments in this story that might put this to rest and really explain it. So there's a lot of details here, but to cut to the chase, there's a man, Orlando Anderson. He's reportedly a member of the Crips, and he was involved in a fight with Tupac and Tupac's entourage earlier that night.
Yeah.
And so I
didn't know that, but it just seemed like convenient. But yes, you're right. It could just be, hey, you fought with me? Okay, you're dead.
Yeah. Which to me makes all the sense in the world. It's a similar kind of scenario, but it's not publicly available. You know, we as the public weren't aware of that fight that happened earlier in the night. You know what I mean? Whereas we're watching this beef go back and forth, and we're imagining the fantasy of essentially this gang on the West Coast against a gang on the East Coast. But it's a much simpler story where Tupac and his entourage have a run-in with a gang member at a hotel earlier that night. You know, shit was talked, and this guy says, "You fucked with the wrong person. I'm going to get you." And he got him later that night.
Right. But so is that not the same? Because I do remember even at the time, because, you know, they were there for the fight. It was the Holyfield fight. It was some huge fight in Vegas. And there was a big altercation in the lobby of the hotel. I forget which hotel.
MGM Grand.
Yeah. There's some big altercation. I remember footage of it and stuff like that. And then like they see, you know, Tupac leaves with his entourage and stuff. And I think myself and many others were like, well, but that guy must be connected with blah, blah, you know.
Yeah, and maybe.
But yeah. Although I do suppose if you were going to assassinate someone on behalf of someone else that you got paid for,
you're not going to
have an altercation and then go do it.
Right. Why? Yeah, exactly. I think that it's important to point this out because a lot of people will think that Sean Combs had Tupac killed, but that doesn't seem to be the expert opinion.
Yeah. And to be clear, there's never been any, you know, charges or judgments.
There is very recently. I'm forgetting all the details, but Orlando Anderson.
No, I mean against Puff, against Sean.
Right. But of course there wouldn't be because he wouldn't have been the one to pull the trigger. But anyway, point is that let's move forward. Okay, so this brings us to 1997, and this is when Biggie was shot and killed in Los Angeles. So what are the theories as to who shot Biggie and why?
Well, at the time, it was like, oh, that's retaliation for Tupac. But more recently, when I deep dove a bit into the Sean Combs stuff, there's a lot of theories about that it was Sean Combs himself that had him off. Right. There were incidents and allegations regarding Biggie's wife. I don't remember if it was wife or girlfriend, and her having an affair with Sean Combs, and then that causing strife. Other people saying, oh yeah, no, it was all about like selling more records, which I feel like is like, wow, you're taking that gamble? Why not just keep him alive? You know. But anyways, that's what I've heard. Those are the...
Yeah. So this has a lot of speculation around it, and unlike the Tupac murder, there's not something that you can easily point to like you can with Tupac with the recent... I think from my memory, the alleged shooter of Tupac, his cousin, I think, has come forward or something like that. Anyway, so the theories are the following. Number one, retaliation for Tupac's murder. It makes sense from a fan perspective, from a limited understanding of the details. It has all the qualities of a cinematic murder back and forth, right? You know, you have big. It doesn't get any bigger than Biggie and Tupac.
Right. And by the way, it could be just like you said. The other case might be as simple as like an altercation in a hotel. Okay, I'm going to shoot you. This could literally be a fan of Tupac is like, yeah, I'm going to kill you
because they thought that Biggie.
Exactly.
Right. Well, I'll get into what the experts are putting at the top of the list. The retaliation for Tupac's murder is not on the experts list. There's no data. There wouldn't necessarily be data, but it's not a prevailing expert theory. The second theory is that Sean Combs was actually the intended target and Biggie just happened to be collateral damage. Again, no data on that. the third theory that you mentioned is that Sean Combs himself actually orchestrated Biggie's murder. Didn't pull the trigger himself, but paid for someone to do it, or paid someone to pay someone to do it or something. And people say, well, but wait, Sean Combs and Biggie were on the same team, so to speak. Well, people have been putting forward a lot of ideas. I think largely just because people hate Sean Combs.
Yeah.
But the reasons that people speculate is that Biggie's death would allow Sean to retain full control over Biggie's music catalog and profits. Now, remember, Biggie had only one album at the time. It was giant. It was assumed that the next number of albums would maybe even be bigger, or at least equally big, right?
But that he would go to a bigger label and...
Right. So that's one of the speculations is that Biggie was with Bad Boy Records, and at the time, although a successful label, there were bigger labels that could entice him more. And remember that Sean Combs had him, in all likelihood, sign a pretty shitty contract up front.
True. He probably was not in a good contract.
Right. So another exec from another outfit could approach Biggie, and probably were, offering not only a better contract, but more resources, maybe more distribution resources or something.
Just seems like a stretch, though, because, again, I mean, sure, the subsequent albums ended up doing really, really well, but I don't know. Like, that's such a gamble.
Well, I think what you're getting at is, like, if you're Sean Combs, you would potentially profit much greater if Biggie is alive, right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's pointed out is that Biggie was negotiating to get ownership of his songs.
I see.
And might have been able to orchestrate that legally or something.
I see.
Whereas with Biggie's death, that would never happen. That Sean Combs would retain full control, and therefore, although not ideal because Biggie would be dead, he was just about to release another album. So Biggie had a lot of tracks that were ready to go. And the second album by Biggie was released. Guess how long after Biggie's death the album was released?
A month?
16 days.
Wow.
So you and I know about music, and we know how the music industry works. You can't just decide.
No.
So that, is a red flag. It's like, because, and of course, the sooner the better in terms of capitalizing on the news story and the zeitgeist and everything. And the album did do very, very well.
Sure, it blew
and I think it
up,
was even a double album as well. So it was like a lot of tracks. But yeah, so posthumously, there have been 3 full albums that were released, including
of recordings that they had.
Because of recordings that they had.
John Lennon style.
Right. Also Tupac style, and Elliott Smith actually had a posthumous album. Yeah. Okay. So 3 full albums and 2 compilation albums. So 5 huge albums were released that Sean Combs, I think, basically owned. He didn't have to share, or he probably had to share some of the percentage with the estate of Biggie. Who knows? But anyway, that's one of the theories. The other is that Sean was worried that Biggie was going to leave Bad Boy Records. To lose Biggie could potentially ruin the label. You know what I mean?
Also, after Biggie's death, that's when, at the time, still Puff Daddy became a music sensation as well.
Right. So that's the other aspect of this theory that people will purport, is that Puff wanted his own career and considered Biggie to be in the way.
But I mean, that seems like that seems too stretchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to say, well, Sean's not that bad. I don't think that's what we're saying. We're saying he's not bad in that way. If the allegations are true, he's a horrific human being, a monster. But the monster behavior that we see is not really in this realm. And there's a lot of reports that Sean Combs and Biggie were actually really close.
Well,
close enough anyway.
So the money one I could consider, right? Because when you're talking about $1 billion for someone who, if any of the allegations are true, has some serious psychological problems, maybe they would consider a horrendous thing like that, right? They would look at it like like a mafia don, right? Like, hey, I love Paulie over here, but they gotta go, I guess. But the one where, like, well, I want to be a musician too, I don't buy that. That seems like a complete stretch.
Yeah. And the experts will agree and say that it's not likely that Sean Combs orchestrated Biggie's murder. Most experts believe, but there's not much data to go off of, but most experts will say that Biggie was in all likelihood killed due to a gang-related violent crime, possibly as a retaliation for Tupac's murder, or just another incident, similar to Tupac.
Yeah.
Tupac, in one way of looking at it, is Tupac pissed off a lot of people and could insult people, make fun of people,
yeah,
joke around or throw his weight around with his bodyguards and stuff. And Tupac just did it with the wrong guy.
Was his murderer caught, Biggie?
No.
The one thing I do wonder about is if you're a billionaire and your supposed best friend gets shot, don't you really try to get those people?
And maybe he did.
And we just will
but
never
that
know
might
about it.
actually, I'm just completely speculating off the dome, but that would mean potentially collaborating with the police, which might not be a good look for Sean Combs. I don't know. The question here, Berto, is how do you think this affected Sean Combs? If we assume, which, a lot of the experts will contend that Sean Combs did not want Biggie to die. He might have even, greatly mourned his death. It also could be very concerning to Sean himself of well, wait, so, some highly protected people with bodyguards, Tupac and Biggie, are being killed. Am I at risk? Is my family at risk? That sort of thing. But I want you to answer that question, Berto, after the break, which is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to see the rest of this video, watch or listen, if you're on YouTube. So if you want access to the rest of this episode, become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.
Pointing at you. The pointing.